Now, with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, you get the creation of a Western-style republic, the Republic of China, oftentimes acronymized as ROC or Zhonghua Mingguo. It's still around today, actually. Fun fact: it's still technically it still exists on the island of Taiwan, even though it's hardly recognized by any countries anywhere in the world. Regardless, the Republic of China is going to be led not by Sun Yat-sen, who actually comes back from exile and has some supporters, but quickly realizes the fate of most exiled politicians who haven't been in their home countries for a long time. I've got a lot of Western support. They really like me. I give all lip service to Western ideals, democracy, all this sort of stuff, but I have no base of support back home. The real base of support, the guy who really has the power, is Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai will be in charge from 1912 to 1916. He was a military strongman from the north who brokered a compromise abdication of the Qing dynasty Manchu imperial court. Basically, he was facing a new army's military garrison revolt in the south, in the southern parts of China. The northern garrisons were more loyal to him, and he was a former Qing dynasty official who basically now is saying, you know what, I'm in a position to basically affect the outcome that is most favorable to me. He tells the revolutionaries that, you know, you can't beat me. I have the stronger armies, and he's right, he does. You can't beat my new armies, and he shows them on the battlefield that whenever he wants to, he can win. And then he turns around and tells the Manchu court in the Forbidden City, he says, you know what, if I lose these battles, and then he loses a few of them to make sure that they know that he can lose them if he wants to. You know, if I lose these battles, a lot of these revolutionaries in the South, they've been weaned on racist anti-Manchu discourse. They think you're barbarians and they're going to cut off the heads of every single one of you. And that scares them into accepting a compromise. The compromise says that, you know, we're going to abdicate, get favorable treatment, be allowed to continue to live in the Forbidden City. You're going to protect the Manchu people, and then we will create a Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen comes back. The Southern revolutionaries say Sun Yat-sen needs to be the new president. He is very briefly. Yuan Shikai says, no, we're going to keep the capital in Beijing. It's in my hands. I'm in power. And then he basically continues to suppress any evidence of political parties, chiefly those represented by Sun Yat-sen and his supporters. The most important party you need to know about is known as the Nationalist Party, with a capital N. Kuomintang, or GMD in modern-day Chinese pronunciation and pinyin transliteration. Oftentimes, the acronym for that you'll see is the old-style one, KMT. So, it's not Chiang Kai-shek yet, he's going to be in the 1920s. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, originally founded by Sun Yat-sen, and then going through several different incarnations. Yuan Shikai is going to see this as a threat. He's going to see it as revolutionary rabble-rousers. Democracy is not going to work in China. He needs a strong man who can bring back the disaffected provinces and restore national unity, and then we're going to kick out the foreigners. So that's his goal. Yuan Shikai's goal in 1912 is to get back the provinces who are no longer submitting tax revenue to the central government. That's a major crisis. Get back national unity, and then he's finally going to kick out the foreign imperialist if he can and restore China's glories. So he cracks down on the Nationalist Party. He suppresses elections, says he's going to have elections, as was agreed to during the abdication in 1911. That was agreed to, so he has elections, and then he assassinates the people who are representatives of the Nationalist Party once he realizes he's going to lose. So he's excoriated. Yuan Shikai is excoriated in most Chinese historiography for being against the parties that will eventually seize power in another 15, 20 years. From a geopolitical strategic perspective, however, Yuan Shikai was quite successful in pursuing his agenda for 3 years, right? 3 years specifically. He was successful in trying to put back the imperial pieces all together. Okay, the rebellions, the foreign invasions, the loss of revenue, all this sort of stuff. The provinces are, you know, not even really, you know, they're mostly autonomous from Beijing. And Yuan Shikai is bringing them back into the fold one by one, replacing some of the people in the South who he sees as, you know, representatives of Southern revolutionaries, the Nationalist Party, getting his supporters in, and revenue is streaming into Beijing by 1915. The problem is World War I. World War I basically sidelines the European powers and their interests, all the interests that they've gotten, the economic and political concessions, extraterritoriality, low tariffs on their goods, that sort of stuff. They're all sidelined by World War I. It diverts their attention back to Europe. There's a vacuum. You think, oh, this is great for Yuan Shikai, right? All the foreign imperialists are gone. No. the vacuum is filled by Japan. That's the problem for Yuan Shikai and the Chinese. Japan will slowly start taking over the imperialist role that the Europeans and Americans previously had, and they will step into the vacuum in 1914 when the Europeans leave. And they waste no time saying, we got to make the most of this and before the Westerners come back. They submit to Yuan Shikai in 1915 what are known as the 21 demands. Wide sweeping concessions, economic, political, chiefly in the northeast where Japan is coming in through Korea into Manchuria, utterly humiliating concessions. They say basically you have to accept this. And if you don't, it'll be grounds for hostilities. And that's not going to turn out well if you can't win the military battle. The 21 demands, Yuan has to submit to it. He has no choice. He knows it'll be suicide to take on the Japanese or any foreign imperialist power at this point. You can't do that, or you're going to go down. You're going to lose the battle, and then you'll still lose. So he accepts the 21 demands with minor revisions to save face, but it doesn't really save much of his face. In an attempt to divert attention from the humiliating concessions of the 21 demands, which is just another unequal treaty essentially, but the most fantastic one yet, he actually then tries to restore the monarchy and set himself up as emperor, trying to project the image of a strong man when he's been totally emasculated. And that gives the provinces the pretext they need to defect from the government and basically come in open rebellion again. Yuan Shikai, deeply depressed in 1916 in the aftermath of the 21 demands and the defection of the provinces, dies of uremia in 1916, and this begins the warlord era. Yuan Shikai was the only military warlord who was able to keep the whole country together. The Japanese destroy his political legitimacy and provides the pretext for the provinces to rebel once again. It's the 1911 revolution all over again. The provinces rebelling against the central government. So it's at this point, with the death of Yuan Shikai, the dark days in which they're realizing nothing we do seems to help, no matter who's in power. It's clearly not the Manchus, because Yuan Shikai was Han. He was Chinese, so we can't just blame the Manchus anymore. The Chinese are also failing. Politics, military reform, nothing seems to be reversing the trend of humiliating China. What's left? Well, this is the beginnings of what's known as the New Culture Movement. The beginning of the idea that what ails China, that what's wrong with China, what is the cause of all of our woes in the modern era, is culture itself. Now this is a big thing, because Chinese culture was always the pride of educated people throughout Chinese history. We have the most glorious, long-lasting, continuous civilization in the history of the world. They took great pride in it. So this is a major movement, the New Culture Movement. Culture must be the problem. We need to reform Chinese civilization itself. So you're going to get several aspects of this. There's going to be debates over reforming the Chinese script. Chinese characters usually seen as near sacred and venerated for their artistic appearance and beautiful internal dynamics. People are now talking seriously about, do we need to adopt a Western alphabet? Do we need to simplify the characters? Do we need to change our language? Maybe the language itself is holding us back, preventing us from educating our populace. New ideas about gender relations. The idea about perhaps free love. You should be able to choose your partner and not have an arranged marriage. New literary forms are going to appear at this time. Instead of using classical Chinese, sort of like the equivalent of clerical Latin, a dead language that is not spoken but is written. That was what all writing was pretty much written in, some form of classical Chinese. Now they're coming up with what's known as Baihua, white speech or plain speech. Write like people talk on the street. And the new literature of the 19-teens and the 1920s and ever since to today is going to be in Baihua, in plain speech. You're going to get the beginning of the careers of some of the most glorious writers, celebrated writers in modern Chinese history, such as Lu Xun. Lu Xun, as many of his short stories are going to be mocking Confucian culture, basically trying to show the corruption and moral bankruptcy of Confucianism and say we need to jettison all of this old stuff from the past. One of his most famous stories, Diary of a Madman, is all about how there's a madman reading through Confucian texts and whatnot and realizing, oh my God, our whole history, Chinese civilization, is cannibalism. Us eating each other and then calling it a virtuous thing. That's sort of a little bit of a flavor of what you're going to get in these new literary forms. You are also going to get wholesale Westernized education. The first generation of people of Chinese brought up to believe that the best proper education is not a Chinese classical education, not even necessarily a mix of Chinese classical education and Western education, although some will do that, but an entirely westernized educational curricula, often mediated through Japan, because Japan has already adopted a Western curricula in many ways. It's this new westernized Chinese generation of young intellectuals that will start undertaking mass urban demonstrations and undertaking political movements. That's unprecedented in Chinese history, to have young, urban, educated youth marching in the streets. And one of the biggest marches in the street is going to be May 4th, 1919, known as the May 4th protest against the treaty in Versailles, ending World War I, in which the Chinese were led to believe that in exchange for their logistical support of the winning side in World War I, they would get German colonial concessions back from Shandong province, and instead backroom dealing gives these to Japan, which also wanted them, and obviously the Chinese feel betrayed, and they say, we're going to repudiate what our impotent diplomats in Versailles have actually signed, and you get this massive demonstration. You get what becomes known as the May 4th movement. Young, urban intellectuals taking a political stand, going into the streets, trying to affect political change. It is sort of the tenor of the 19-teens and the 1920s. Everything else has failed to save China. We need new solutions, new culture, new education, and a new agent of agitation. Young, educated intellectuals going out into the streets. Okay, something that you didn't do in the old society. Peasants would rise up. Peasants would have peasant uprisings and whatnot. Military leaders would organize their own revolts. But if you were an educated elite gentleman, you submitted your petition. You didn't, get 200 of your fellow students and march in the street, okay, and agitate and whatnot. Now, amid all of this unrest and what's going on, this is the warlord era now. Yuan Shikai has died. Each province has several warlords who have their own autonomous regions and whatnot, and often sometimes fight with one another. Amid all of this, you get the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is a pretty big deal in China. It's a revolution that seems to be against the Western system, the Western imperialist system, but it is of the West as well. These are Westerners. The Russians are Westerners. Marxism is a Western ideology, so it has the prestige of a modern Western idea, but it also has an anti-imperialist ideology. It's going to be very inspiring to many of these young intellectuals who are part of the new culture movement, the May 4th movement, and it's going to lead to the rise of two Leninist Party states. Okay, Leninist Party states. You have an ideology, you have a cohesiveness, a hierarchical rank, you produce propaganda, you have a military, new political parties inspired by what the Bolsheviks are doing in Russia. All right, and amid the Bolshevik Revolution, you're going to see the rise of the two Leninist Party states in China. One of them is going to be a rejuvenation of the GMD, the KMT, the Nationalist Party with the capital N. This is going to be done. It's already it was suppressed and exploited, and many people assassinated under Yuan Shikai when he didn't like the results of the elections in the early 19-teens. Now they're going to say we're going to revamp the Nationalist Party. Who can be sort of the figurehead, the guy who leads it? Well, Sun Yat-sen, an earlier incarnation of this party, was his party. He's still alive. And not only is he still alive, he's like the only surviving early revolutionary who has been untainted by actual residence in China. If he actually had a long political career in China, Sun Yat-sen would have had to make a lot of compromise and betray his own ideals, and that would have tarnished his reputation. The fact that he's almost constantly in exile outside of China sort of preserves the ideal image of this. He's the earliest surviving revolutionary, and the Russians decide we're going to put our support behind Sun Yat-sen with a rejuvenated nationalist party in the south, in Guangzhou. Okay, and that's going to happen in 1924. You're going to get the creation of the Whampoa Academy in Guangzhou under Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen will say, who's going to lead my Whampoa Military Academy, train new officers under the tutelage of Bolshevik Russian officers who are sent from Moscow? Chiang Kai-shek. This is where we get Chiang Kai-shek coming into it. He becomes the head of the Whampoa Academy, and that's where his power is going to derive, from the barrel of a gun. You also get the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, in its English acronym, in Shanghai in 1921. However, the CCP, the Russians are obviously in support of it. They're in support of, the Comintern, the Communist International, wants to have communist parties throughout the world, but they don't think that the CCP in China is really that promising. They don't think that that's where you have a lot of substantive organic support already. They say, no, we're going to put all of our eggs or all of our eggs but one, into the Sun Yat-sen Nationalist Party basket, and then we'll leave one egg for the CCP in Shanghai. So they exist, but they're not going to be able to seize power anytime soon. And that's true. They're basically just urban intellectuals agitating, trying to get the proletariat to rise up. There isn't much proletariat, urban workers and whatnot in Chinese cities yet. And they're agitating pretty much unsuccessfully for workers' strikes and worker unrest in major eastern seaboard cities, oftentimes the ones where you have Western concessions. For years in the 1920s, but they don't really manage to make much headway. The CCP remains quite small for its first several years. The real Russian support was for Sun Yat-sen and the Whampoa Academy, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek, who's going to take over that military part of the party. Fatefully, Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925. And when he dies, that's when Chiang Kai-shek manages to push his rivals aside, take control of the military, and take control of the Nationalist Party. Soon after Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, you get another one of these imperialist outrages known as the May 30th incident, in which you have lots of those street demonstrations, once again, from that urban educated youth, a product of the May 4th, the New Culture and May 4th movement. It was basically British and Japanese factory owners had ordered them to fire on Chinese students who were protesting in the streets about the death of a Chinese worker inside their factory. And again, the detail is not so important as the big picture here. Massive street demonstrations on after May 30th, 1925. This allows the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party to be able to recruit massive new members into their party, and their party ranks swell over the course of 1925 and 1926, so much so, in fact, that Chiang Kai-shek believes in 1926 he's ready for a military expedition known as the Northern Expedition. Now we can go from Guangzhou in the south, and we can start beating warlords on our way to Beijing and create a new central government and unified China. The CCP, the Chinese Communists, are forced into the coalition by the Bolsheviks, by the Russians. They say you're going to work with the Nationalist Party, that they have the best chance for success, and one day in the future, we'll find a way for you to get influence. The Northern Expedition stops in 1927. It's known as the Second Aborted Revolution, the first aborted revolution being the 1911 Revolution. Stops in 1927 with Chiang Kai-shek running into Japanese soldiers stationed just south of Beijing in the city of Jinan, and realizing, if I go any further north, I'm going to have to start fighting the Japanese. There's going to be an incident. The Japanese will fire on me. And just like Yuan Shikai before, he says, I cannot fight the Japanese. Political, military suicide. So he says, we're gonna consolidate our gains, look on the bright side, and take over the city of Shanghai. It's going to be his banking financial center, and set up our new capital, Nanjing, in the south, and switch the capital from Beijing to Nanjing. There are many consequences of this, of course. He doesn't really get rid of all the warlords. His base of power is only in the Yangtze River Delta region. And foreign imperialists are still stationed all over the place. He then turns his attention to purging the Chinese communists instead, known as the White Terror, April 1927. Suddenly he turns on his Chinese communist so-called allies that the Russians had forced him to work with, and purges them from the party. Mass executions, surprise executions in all the major cities under Chiang Kai-shek's control. This is when the CCP has to retreat to the countryside. Mao Zedong is still quite insignificant at this point, but his rise to prominence is not far off. Next up, we're going to look at the late 1920s and 1930s, what is known as the Nanjing Decade, the progress that the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek is able to make, until finally they do have to confront Japan and go into all-out war.